There are nights that test everything we believe about the world. Nights when nature strips away all comfort and pretense and leaves us face to face with our own fragility, our own mortality, the thin thread by which life hangs in the coldest, darkest hours. In the medieval highlands and mountain valleys of Europe, shepherds knew these nights intimately. They knew what it meant to be caught far from shelter when winter storms descended without warning, when temperatures dropped so low that breath froze in the air, when the choice became to abandon your flock and save yourself, or stay with them and likely die alongside them. Tonight, I want to tell you about one such night, one particular shepherd, and a miracle so quiet and subtle that it could easily have been missed, overlooked, dismissed as nothing more than fortunate weather or natural variation in temperature. But those who witnessed it, those who heard the story and passed it down through generations, understood that they were preserving something sacred, something that spoke to the deepest human needs for protection, for warmth, for the reassurance that we are not alone in our struggles against the cold indifference of nature. The story is known by different names in different regions. In some Celtic traditions, it appears as the shepherd's vigil or the flock that would not die. In Germanic folklore, it is sometimes called Das Wunder der Winterwärme, the miracle of winter warmth. In the mountainous regions where sheep farming was essential to survival, where shepherds spent more time with their flocks than with their families, the story was simply called the night the sheep were kept, with no elaboration needed because everyone understood what keeping meant in that context. Preservation of life against impossible odds, protection granted when all natural protection had failed. Like many medieval miracle stories, this tale exists in variations. Sometimes the shepherd is young, sometimes old. Sometimes the flock numbers 50, sometimes just a dozen. Sometimes the storm lasts one night, sometimes 3. The location shifts: Scottish highlands in some versions, Welsh mountains in others, alpine meadows in still others, the Pyrenees, the Carpathians, anywhere that sheep were raised in harsh climates, and shepherds faced the constant threat of weather that could kill. But the heart of the story remains constant across all tellings. A shepherd caught in a deadly winter storm with his flock, facing certain death for himself and his animals, choosing to stay rather than flee, and discovering in the darkest hours that warmth can come from sources we cannot see or explain, that protection exists beyond what we can provide for ourselves, that life persists even when all logic says it should surrender to the cold. Medieval people needed these stories perhaps more than we can fully understand from our position of relative comfort and security. Winter for them was not an inconvenience, but a genuine trial, a season that killed the weak and the unlucky, that tested endurance and faith in equal measure. Shepherds in particular occupied a vulnerable position, necessary to the community's survival, providing wool and meat and milk, but themselves living on the margins, spending long periods alone in harsh conditions, dependent on the health of animals that could die from cold or disease or predation, leaving the shepherd with nothing. These were not romantic figures living pastoral idyls among gentle flocks in sunny meadows. These were working men, and sometimes women and children, who labored in difficult, dangerous conditions for modest returns, who knew hunger and cold and the constant anxiety of being responsible for living creatures whose survival determined whether the shepherd's own family would eat, whether rent could be paid, whether another year could be survived. There were people for whom a single bad storm, a single night of killing cold, could mean the difference between bare survival and absolute destitution. So when stories emerged of shepherds and flocks miraculously preserved through nights that should have killed them, these stories mattered. They offered hope that divine protection extended to the humble and the hardworking, that God or angels or the protective spirits of the land watched over those who could not watch over themselves, that faith and faithfulness would be honored, that staying true to your obligations, even at the cost of your own life, was a virtue that would be recognized and rewarded. The story we tell tonight comes from somewhere in the northern lands, from a time when winters were even harsher than they are now, during what historians call the Little Ice Age, when Europe endured centuries of colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, harder winters that pushed communities to the edge of what they could endure. It was a time when stories of miraculous warmth were not just comforting but necessary, reminders that spring would come again, that life was stronger than death, that warmth persisted even in the coldest darkness. So let us go to that place, that time, that cold night on a mountainside. Let us meet the shepherd who loved his flock enough to die with them rather than abandon them. And let us witness what happened when loyalty met miracle, when human devotion opened the door to divine protection, when warmth came from no visible source, but was nonetheless undeniably real. The land where our story takes place was beautiful in the way that harsh places can be beautiful, austere, unforgiving, but possessed of a stark grandeur that inspired awe in those who lived among its hills and valleys. This was not gentle farming country with rich soil and abundant crops. This was marginal land, too steep or rocky or cold for grain cultivation, suited primarily for grazing animals that could survive on sparse vegetation and endure the long winters that characterized the region. Stone walls divided the landscape, built over generations by farmers and shepherds from rocks cleared from fields, creating a patchwork of small enclosures and larger common grazing areas. The walls were functional rather than decorative, low enough that healthy sheep could jump them if they chose, but sufficient to mark boundaries and provide minimal windbreak. They snaked across hillsides, following the contours of the land, monuments to backbreaking labor and the human need to impose some order on the wild landscape. Scattered through this territory were cottages, small stone structures with thatched or turf roofs, housing families who worked this ungenerous land. Each family might have a few sheep, a cow or two, chickens, a small plot where they could grow some vegetables, and perhaps a little grain if the summer was long enough and the frost held off. But sheep were the foundation of survival here, providing wool that could be spun and woven, meat for special occasions, lambs that could be sold for income, milk that could be made into cheese. The sheep were not merely livestock, but partners in survival, and the relationship between shepherds and their flocks had a depth that went beyond economics into something closer to kinship. The shepherd in our story lived in one of these cottages with his family, his wife, and his children, whose exact number varies in different tellings, but was enough that feeding them required all the income his flock could provide. He was neither young nor old, somewhere in that middle span of life when a man has experience and strength in roughly equal measure. He had been shepherding since childhood, had learned the work from his father, knew every aspect of caring for sheep through all the seasons and in all weathers. This flock numbered perhaps 40 or 50 sheep, not a large flock by the standards of wealthy landowners, but substantial for a man of modest means, representing years of careful management, successful breeding, the gradual accumulation of capital in the form of living animals. Each sheep had value not just as a commodity, but as an individual creature that he knew by sight, by temperament, by the particulars of its health and history. He knew which ewes were the best mothers, which rams were most reliable for breeding, which lambs showed the most promise for keeping back to expand the flock. This knowledge was not sentimental but practical, the necessary wisdom of someone whose survival depended on understanding the creatures in his care. But it created a bond nonetheless, a relationship built on daily attention and mutual dependence. The sheep relied on him for protection from predators, for guidance to good grazing, for treatment when they fell ill or injured, for being led to shelter when weather threatened. He relied on them for everything his family needed, for the wool and meat and milk that sustained them, for the modest prosperity that separated them from absolute poverty. Winter in this region came early and stayed late, settling in by November and not releasing its grip until March or April. During these months, the sheep required constant attention. They needed supplemental feeding when snow covered the grazing, needed checking for illness, needed protection from the wolves and wild dogs that became bolder as winter progressed and their own food sources diminished. The shepherd would go out daily, regardless of weather, walking among his flock, counting to ensure none had wandered off or been taken by predators, checking for signs of disease or injury that could spread through the entire group if not caught early. It was exhausting work made more difficult by the cold, by snow that had to be trudged through, by winds that cut through even the heaviest woolen cloak, by the short days that meant much of the work happened in darkness or twilight. The shepherd's hands were perpetually chapped and cracked from cold and wet, his face weathered beyond his years by constant exposure to harsh conditions. He developed a cough every winter that did not fully clear until spring. His body ached in ways that told him he would not be able to do this work forever, that eventually age would make the demands impossible, and he would have to pass the responsibility to a son or give up shepherding entirely and face poverty in his old age. But for now, he endured. He did what needed doing because there was no alternative, because his family depended on him, because the sheep depended on him, because this was the life he had been given and the work he knew how to do. There was a kind of dignity in this, a quiet heroism in the daily choice to continue, to not give up, to shoulder the burden one more day, and then another, building a life from the accumulation of these small acts of perseverance. The landscape he worked in was treacherous in winter. Hills that were merely steep in summer became dangerous when covered with ice and snow. Valleys that provided shelter could become traps when storms filled them with drifts taller than a man. Streams that were easily crossed in warmer months froze solid, their surfaces deceptively smooth, hiding currents beneath that could pull you under if you broke through. The shepherd had to know all of this, had to read the land and the weather with an accuracy that could mean the difference between survival and death. He learned to interpret the sky, to recognize the subtle signs that presage storms, certain cloud formations, particular qualities of light, the behavior of birds and wild animals that sense changes in air pressure and temperature before humans could detect them. He learned to judge snow, to distinguish the light, dry powder that would blow away from the heavy, wet snow that would accumulate into drifts. He learned which areas offered the best natural shelter, where rock formations or thick stands of trees could provide windbreak and protection. This knowledge was accumulated slowly, taught by his father and by his own experience, by the mistakes that had cost him sheep in previous years, by the close calls that had taught him where the margins of safety lay. It was knowledge that could not be written down or fully communicated to someone who had not lived it, that existed in the body and the instincts as much as in the conscious mind, that made the difference between a shepherd who survived and one who was found frozen in the spring when the snow melted. On the day that would lead to the miracle of our story, the shepherd had taken his flock to a grazing area several miles from his cottage, a place where the snow was lighter and the sheep could still paw through to reach the dried grass beneath. It was late afternoon in midwinter, that time of year when daylight was precious and brief, when the sun barely rose above the horizon before beginning its descent again, when you measured your activities by the handful of hours between dawn and dusk. The weather when he left home had been cold but clear, the kind of day when you could work outside if you kept moving and stayed out of the wind. He had intended to return before dark, to have the flock safely near the cottage where he could check them one more time before the overnight hours when cold was most dangerous and predators most active. It was a routine day, or should have been, just another in the long series of winter days that had to be gotten through until spring finally came. But weather in the mountains is treacherous and changeable, and what begins as a clear day can become deadly with frightening speed when conditions shift and storms move in faster than anyone can flee them. The shepherd, experienced as he was, had made the calculation that many shepherds had made before him, that he had time to get his flock to good grazing and return before conditions deteriorated. And like many shepherds before him, he would discover that sometimes those calculations are wrong, that nature does not always follow predictable patterns, that experience is no guarantee against disaster when the weather turns against you. The change began subtly, so gradually that at first the shepherd did not recognize it as the warning it was. The light quality shifted, taking on a peculiar flat gray tone that experienced outdoorsmen learned to associate with approaching storms. The wind, which had been steady from the west, began to gust erratically, changing direction, picking up in strength. The temperature, already cold, dropped noticeably, the kind of sudden chill that goes straight through clothing and makes you instinctively hunch your shoulders and tuck your hands inside your cloak. The sheep felt it before he fully registered it. They began moving restlessly, clustering together more tightly than usual, making small bleating sounds of distress or concern. Sheep are not intelligent in the ways humans value intelligence, but they have instincts honed by countless generations, survival knowledge coded into their behavior. They knew something was wrong with the weather, knew it in their bones and their nervous systems, and they were trying to tell him what he had not yet fully admitted to himself, that they were in danger, that they needed shelter, that they should already be moving to safety. The shepherd looked at the sky and felt his stomach tighten with the cold, not of fear. The clouds that had been high and scattered were now low and dark. moving with the characteristic speed that meant a major storm was bearing down on them. Snow began to fall, not the gentle flakes of a light snowfall, but hard, driving pellets of ice and snow that stung the face and reduced visibility within minutes. The wind rose from strong gusts to sustained gale force, the kind of wind that makes it hard to stand, that tears at clothing and steals warmth from any exposed skin. He made the decision immediately. They had to move, had to try to reach home, or at least find better shelter than this exposed grazing area offered. He called to his dogs, the trained sheepdogs that were his partners in managing the flock, and together they began trying to move the sheep in the right direction. But the storm was intensifying with terrifying rapidity, and the sheep, already frightened, were becoming difficult to control. They wanted to turn away from the wind, to follow their instinct to put their backs to the storm, but that direction led further into the open hills, away from any possible shelter. The shepherd fought to keep them moving in the right direction, using his voice and his staff and the dogs to counter their panicked instincts. But it was like trying to push water uphill. For every few yards they gained towards safety, they would break and scatter and have to be gathered again, precious time and energy spent on maintaining any kind of organized movement. The snow was falling so heavily now that he could barely see more than a few feet in any direction, the world reduced to a white chaos of wind and snow and cold. He realized with sick certainty that they were not going to make it home. The distance was too far, the storm too strong, the sheep too panicked. Continuing to try would mean getting caught in completely open terrain with no shelter whatsoever, a death sentence in weather this severe. He had to find shelter now, had to get the flock to some kind of protection where they might have a chance of surviving until the storm passed. Through the whiteout conditions, using knowledge of the landscape that was more felt than seen, he guided the flock toward a place he remembered, a hillside with a steep rock face that offered some shelter from the prevailing winds. It was not much, not a cave or an overhang that would provide real protection, just a spot where the hill itself would block the worst of the wind, and perhaps the rock would retain some small measure of heat. It was better than nothing, which was what they would have if he did not find it soon. The journey to this spot should have taken 15 minutes. In the storm, fighting the wind and the snow and the panicked sheep, it took over an hour. By the time they reached the rock face, the shepherd was exhausted, his clothes soaked through despite being wool, his hands and feet so cold they had moved past pain into numbness. The sheep were in no better condition, their wool caked with ice, their breathing labored, their movements sluggish with cold and exhaustion. He got them as close to the rock face as he could, using the dogs to keep them pressed against the stone where the wind was somewhat less severe. The dogs themselves were suffering, their fur frozen into icy clumps, but they continued working because that was what they were trained to do, what their breeding and their bond with the shepherd compelled them to do. They would work until they dropped, and he knew that they would probably not survive this night, and the grief of that knowledge added to the terrible weight of what was happening. The shepherd himself had no shelter beyond what the rock face provided. He huddled with his flock, his back to the wind, his body positioned to shield as many of the sheep as he could, knowing even as he did it that it was a futile gesture, that his body heat was insignificant against this cold, that he was probably only ensuring that he would die alongside them rather than die alone. The temperature continued to drop as night fell fully. The shepherd had been cold before, had experienced bitter winter nights during his years of shepherding, but this was different. This was cold that attacked with malice, that found every gap in clothing, every patch of exposed skin, that drew heat from the body faster than the body could generate it, that made breathing painful and thinking difficult and movement increasingly impossible. He could feel himself shutting down, his body sacrificing extremities to keep the core alive, and he knew that this was how freezing to death happened, this gradual surrender to the cold that eventually stopped being painful and started being almost peaceful, the final numbness before consciousness faded entirely. The sheep had stopped moving, conserving what little energy they had left, pressed together in a tight mass with the shepherd at their center. He could feel them against him, could hear their labored breathing, could sense their fear and their failing strength. These animals that he had cared for, that had been his responsibility and his livelihood, and in some real sense his companions, were dying. They were dying because he had miscalculated the weather, had waited too long to seek shelter, had made the wrong judgment about whether there was time to graze them before the storm hit. The guilt of this, the knowledge that his failure had doomed not just himself but creatures that depended on him for protection, was almost worse than the physical cold. He had stayed with them, had not abandoned them to save himself, but he knew that by morning they would all be frozen corpses, that his family would find them when they came looking, that his wife would be left without a husband and his children without a father, and they would all be without the flock that had sustained them. His faithfulness would not save them. His love for these animals would not warm them. All he could offer was to die alongside them rather than alone. A gesture that changed nothing, but somehow still felt necessary, still felt like the only choice that honored the bond between shepherd and flock. He prayed, fumbling through prayers he had learned as a child, prayers for mercy and protection and salvation. He prayed for his family, that they would somehow survive his loss, that others in the community would help them, that they would not starve or freeze in the winters to come without him. He prayed for his sheep, which seemed perhaps ridiculous to pray for animals when human life was at stake, but he had spent so much of his life caring for them that he could not simply dismiss them now as unworthy of divine concern. And he prayed for himself, for forgiveness for his failures, for peace as death approached, for the strength to endure whatever hours remained before the cold finally claimed him. The wind continued its assault, the snow continued falling, and the temperature continued dropping. The shepherd felt consciousness starting to fade at the edges, felt the dangerous drowsiness that comes with severe hypothermia, the temptation to close his eyes and rest that he knew would lead to never waking again. He fought it, knowing that once he slept he would die, but fighting was becoming harder, requiring more will than he possessed, demanding more from a body that had nothing left to give. His dogs had curled up against him, their own bodies failing, their devotion absolute even at the end. One of them, the older female who had been with him for years, licked his hand once, a gesture of affection or perhaps goodbye. The sheep had fallen silent, their breathing shallow, their bodies growing still. This was death, then. This was how it ended. Not at home surrounded by loved ones, not in old age after a long life, but here on a frozen hillside, huddled against rock in a storm, dead of his own poor judgment and the indifference of nature. There was no drama to it, no moment of heroic defiance or poetic final words, just cold and exhaustion and the gradual fading of consciousness and life. The shepherd closed his eyes, no longer able to keep them open, no longer certain why he should try. He said one more prayer, though he was no longer sure if the words were audible or just thought or perhaps nothing at all. His mind beginning to separate from his body as hypothermia took its final toll. And then there was nothing but the darkness and the cold and the gradual letting go of everything that had mattered, of awareness and memory and identity itself. All of it slipping away into the whiteness of the storm and the finality of winter and the mercy of unconsciousness before the end. In the deepest part of the night, in the hours when cold is most severe and death most likely, something changed. The change was subtle at first, so gradual and gentle that it did not immediately register in the shepherd's failing consciousness. The killing cold that had been stealing his life began, almost imperceptibly, to ease. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a quiet steadiness that suggested not natural variation, but intentional intervention, as if something or someone had decided that enough was enough, that this death would not happen, that protection would be granted. The shepherd, hovering in that twilight state between life and death, between consciousness and its absence, felt warmth begin to surround him. It started as barely noticeable, just the faintest suggestion that the terrible drawing of heat from his body had slowed. Then it became more distinct, a presence of warmth that had no visible source, no fire, no light, nothing that his fading senses could identify as the origin of this impossible change in temperature. His first confused thought was that he must be dying, that this was the final stage before death, when the body's temperature regulation fails completely and creates the illusion of warmth, the phenomenon that causes freezing people to remove their clothing in their final moments because they feel hot rather than cold. But this warmth was different from that delusion. It was external, something happening to him rather than something his body was producing. And it was real, measurably real, warming his frozen extremities, returning sensation to hands and feet that had long since gone numb. The sheep felt it too. The ones pressed closest to the shepherd began to stir slightly, lifting heads that had drooped nearly to the ground, making small sounds that were not quite bleats, but contained a note of confusion or wonder, as if they too sensed that something impossible was occurring. The tight, desperate huddle of bodies began to relax fractionally, the tension of extreme cold replaced by something closer to normal rest, their breathing deepening and steadying from the shallow gasps of approaching death. The shepherd forced his eyes open, struggling against exhaustion and hypothermia and the overwhelming desire to return to unconsciousness. He needed to understand what was happening, needed to see if there was some natural explanation for this warming. Another shepherd approaching with a torch, his family having come to search for him bringing fire. Anything that would make sense of this impossible comfort in the midst of deadly cold. But there was nothing to see. The storm continued unabated, snow still falling heavily, wind still roaring. The rock face behind them remained just rock, offering shelter from the wind, but no source of heat. There was no fire, no torch, no light of any kind beyond the diffuse grayness that was all the starlight and moonlight that could penetrate the storm clouds. Yet the warmth continued to grow, to surround them like an invisible blanket, maintaining itself despite the wind that should have swept it away immediately, persisting despite having no physical source or explanation. The shepherd's mind, still functioning despite his earlier approach to death's threshold, tried to make sense of what he was experiencing. He was a practical man, used to dealing with the concrete realities of weather and animals and survival. He was not given to visions or mystical experiences. Yet he could not deny what his body was telling him, that warmth surrounded him where no warmth should be, that he was being kept alive by something that had no natural explanation, that his sheep were being preserved by an intervention that transcended the normal workings of the world. Medieval people, when they told this story, had various explanations for what was happening on that hillside. Some said it was angels, divine beings sent to protect the faithful shepherd who had chosen to stay with his flock rather than abandon them. The angels brought warmth from heaven itself, warmth that no earthly cold could overcome, maintaining it through the night until the danger had passed. This interpretation appealed particularly to those who saw the story through a Christian lens, who connected the shepherd's loyalty to his flock with Christ's identification as the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. Others suggested it was the mercy of God directly manifested, a miracle granted not because the shepherd had earned it through exceptional virtue, but because divine compassion operates according to rules we cannot fully understand, showing favor to the humble and the hardworking, honoring those who honor their responsibilities even at great cost to themselves. This explanation emphasized that miracles were not rewards but gifts, that grace was unearned by definition, that we cannot predict or control when divine intervention will occur, but can only recognize it with gratitude when it does. Still others, drawing on older, pre-Christian beliefs that had never entirely disappeared from rural folk culture, spoke of protective spirits of the land, genius loci that watched over certain places and the creatures that inhabited them. In this interpretation, the shepherd's deep connection to the landscape, his years of working among these hills, his respect for the animals in his care, had created a bond that the spirits recognized and honored, offering protection when it was most desperately needed. Some versions of the story emphasize the animals themselves, suggesting that the warmth came from the collective life force of the flock, that their desire to survive combined with the shepherd's love for them created something that transcended individual bodies, a shared warmth that kept all of them alive. This interpretation resonated with the medieval understanding that animals had souls even if different from human souls, that they could participate in divine action, that the bonds between humans and animals created obligations on both sides. The shepherd, experiencing the miracle rather than interpreting it, understood only that he was being saved, that his sheep were being preserved, that something beyond his comprehension had intervened in what should have been their death. He felt his heart filling with emotions too complex to name. Gratitude certainly, but also awe, fear of the sacred, wonder at being chosen for this intervention, humility at receiving what he had not earned and could not repay. He could feel his body recovering. Sensation returned fully to his extremities, the dangerous numbness replaced by normal feeling. His breathing, which had been shallow and labored, deepened and steadied. His mind cleared from the confusion of hypothermia, thoughts becoming coherent again, memory and identity reasserting themselves. He was not dying. Against all odds and logic, he was going to survive. The sheep were similarly recovering. The ones who had been closest to death began moving more freely, shaking snow from their wool, repositioning themselves within the huddle. Their breathing normalized. Their eyes, which had been dull with approaching death, regained their alertness. They were living creatures again rather than bodies in the process of freezing, returned from the edge of extinction by warmth that should not exist. The dogs too revived, lifting their heads, looking at the shepherd with expressions that seemed almost questioning, as if they too recognized that something extraordinary was occurring but could not understand what. They stayed close to him, their training and their bond keeping them in position, but their tails moved slightly, a sign of life and energy that had been absent when they had seemed moments from death. The warmth maintained itself throughout the rest of the night, steady and reliable, defying the storm that continued to rage around them. It did not grow warmer, did not become tropical, or even comfortable by normal standards, but it kept them safely above the threshold of hypothermia, preserved them in a state where life could continue rather than surrendering to the cold. It was as if an invisible wall surrounded their shelter, a boundary that the deadly cold could not cross, that held death at bay through hours when death should have been inevitable. The shepherd stayed awake through most of the remaining night, too amazed to sleep, too aware of the miracle to waste it in unconsciousness. He prayed, but his prayers had changed character. Earlier, in the depths of his despair, he had prayed for mercy and salvation with the desperation of someone who had no hope of receiving what he asked. Now he prayed with gratitude, with wonder, with the humility of someone who has received far more than he deserved, who has been given his life back when it should have been lost. He thought about his family, about seeing them again, about the gift he had been given not just of his own survival, but of being able to return to those who loved him, to continue being husband and father, to fulfill those roles that had seemed finished when the storm trapped him. He thought about his sheep, about being able to continue caring for them, about the wool they would produce and the lambs they would bear and the future they represented not just for him, but for his family's survival. He thought about the mystery of what was happening, about how he would explain this when he returned home, about whether anyone would believe him or whether they would think the cold had affected his mind, made him imagine things that had not occurred. But he also understood that it did not matter whether others believed him. He knew what was happening. He was experiencing it in his body and his bones. The warmth was real even if its source was invisible. The miracle was occurring even if it defied explanation. As he sat there through the dark hours, the shepherd became aware of something else, something that added another layer to the wonder of what was happening. He felt peace, a deep and abiding sense of calm that had nothing to do with his physical comfort or his relief at surviving. It was peace that came from knowing, really knowing at a level deeper than intellectual understanding, that he was not alone, that he was seen and known and cared for, that the universe was not the cold, indifferent machine that the storm suggested, but something warmer, something that responded to love and loyalty and need. This peace settled into him, became part of him, a gift that would outlast the night and the miracle, that would sustain him through future hardships and fears. He had been given not just physical warmth, but spiritual warmth, not just preservation of his life, but reassurance about the meaning of that life, about its value and purpose and place in a larger story. The night wore on. The storm gradually diminished, not ending suddenly, but slowly losing its fury, the wind dropping from gale force to merely strong, the snow changing from blinding sheets to steady fall to occasional flurries. The darkness began to thin at the edges, the first hint that dawn was approaching, that the long night was finally ending, that they had survived to see another day. The shepherd had dozed despite his intention to stay awake, lulled by the warmth and the gradually quieting storm and his own exhaustion. He woke to find dawn breaking, pale lights spreading across the snow-covered landscape, the storm having passed completely, leaving behind a world transformed and silent, covered in fresh snow that glittered in the early morning sun like a blanket of diamonds stretching as far as he could see. For a moment, he simply lay there, his body still warm, his mind slowly engaging with consciousness, not yet fully remembering where he was or what had happened. Then memory returned. The storm, the terrible cold, the approach of death, and then the impossible warmth that had saved them. He sat up quickly, looking around, half expecting to find that the warmth had been a dream, that he would discover himself frozen or dying, or that his sheep had perished while he slept. But the sheep were alive. Not just alive, but moving, rising to their feet, shaking snow from their wool, making the soft, bleating sounds they made in the morning when they were ready to graze. He could see their breath misting in the cold air, could see the steam rising from their bodies as their internal heat met the frigid morning. Their wool was warm to the touch when he reached out to them, warmer than it should be, retaining the heat that the miracle had granted them through the night. The shepherd stood, his legs steady beneath him, his body functioning normally despite the ordeal he had been through. By all rights, he should be weak, exhausted, suffering from frostbite and hypothermia. Instead, he felt well, perhaps even better than well, as if the warmth that had saved him had not just prevented harm, but it actively restored him, healing the damage the cold had begun to inflict before the miracle intervened. He counted his flock, going through them carefully, checking each animal. Every single one had survived. There were no frozen corpses, no sheep lying dead in the snow, no losses at all from a night that should have killed most, if not all of them. Some looked slightly worse for the experience, their movements a bit stiff, their energy not quite at normal levels. But these were minor effects, the kind of thing that a day or two of normal care would resolve. They had come through the night that should have been their last, and they had emerged intact. His dogs were also alive and well, showing no signs of the near-death state they had been in hours before. They moved among the sheep with their usual efficiency, ready to work, their bodies functioning as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The older female came to him and pressed against his leg, and he reached down to stroke her head, feeling tears starting to form as he fully comprehended the magnitude of what had occurred. They had all been dying. He had felt death approaching, had accepted it as inevitable, had made his peace with the end. And yet here they all were, alive in the morning light, preserved by something that defied natural law, saved by grace that had no earthly source or explanation. The miracle was complete, undeniable, absolute. The shepherd looked around at the landscape, trying to understand where he was, how to get home from this spot. The heavy snow had changed everything, covering familiar landmarks, transforming the terrain into something both beautiful and disorienting. But he had lived in these hills all his life, and even with the changes the storm had wrought, he could read the shape of the land, could orient himself by the position of the sun and the distinctive profiles of distant peaks. He began moving his flock, gently urging them into motion, and they responded readily, their instincts telling them it was time to move, to seek food and water, to return to familiar territory. The going was difficult through the deep snow, but it was possible, and after the impossibility of survival they had just experienced, mere difficulties seemed trivial, manageable, even welcome as proof that they were alive and functioning and capable of continuing. As they moved, the shepherd noticed something else remarkable. The route he was taking should have been exhausting, pushing through snow that came past his knees in places, breaking trail for the flock to follow. But he did not feel the exhaustion he should feel. His body, which should have been weakened by the ordeal, instead felt strong, energized, capable. It was as if the warmth that had preserved him through the night had done more than just prevent death. It had restored him, filled him with vitality that carried him forward with strength he had not possessed even before the storm. The sun rose higher, warming the day slightly, though the temperature remained well below freezing. The snow glittered brilliantly, almost painfully bright, forcing the shepherd to squint against the glare. The sky was clear now, unmarked by the clouds that had brought the storm, the blue so deep and pure it seemed infinite. It was the kind of day that makes you grateful to be alive, that reminds you of beauty even in the harshness of winter, that speaks of renewal and hope despite the cold. As the shepherd and his flock crested a rise, he saw his cottage in the valley below, smoke rising from the chimney, a sign that his family was there, alive, going about their morning routines. The sight of it made his throat tight with emotion, made him walk faster despite the deep snow, pulling ahead of the flock in his eagerness to reach home, to see his wife and children, to tell them he had survived when they must have feared the worst. They had surely known he was in danger. When he had not returned the previous evening, when the storm had come in with such violence, they would have understood that he was caught out in it, that his chances of survival were poor. His wife would have spent the night in anguish, knowing there was nothing she could do, unable to search for him in the storm, forced to wait and hope and pray. His children would have sensed their mother's fear, would have understood that their father might not come home, that the storm might have taken him as it had taken others over the years. But he was coming home. He was alive, and his flock was alive, and the miracle that had preserved them was a gift not just to him, but to his entire family, sparing them the grief and hardship of his loss. This thought, the awareness of what his survival meant to others, intensified his gratitude until it felt almost overwhelming, a physical presence in his chest that made breathing difficult and tears run freely down his weathered face. His wife saw him first, coming out of the cottage to fetch water from the well. She froze for a moment, not trusting her eyes, not believing that the figure approaching through the snow with a flock of sheep could be her husband, whom she had believed lost. Then she dropped the bucket and ran toward him, her cloak forgotten, her feet bare despite the snow, her voice calling his name with a mixture of joy and disbelief and overwhelming relief. They met in the snow, and he held her as she wept against his chest, her body shaking with the release of terror she had carried through the night. He told her he was well, that the sheep were well, that something extraordinary had happened, that they had been saved by a miracle he could not fully explain. She did not ask for explanations then, did not need to know the details. It was enough that he was alive, that he had returned when she had been preparing herself to be a widow, that her children would not grow up without a father. The children emerged from the cottage, drawn by their mother's cry, and they too ran to him, and he knelt in the snow to embrace them all, his family intact, his flock intact, his life given back when it should have been lost. They stood together in the snow for a long moment, a tight knot of connection and gratitude and relief, while the sheep grazed nearby on whatever they could find beneath the snow, and the dogs sat patiently waiting for their next instructions, and the sun continued its slow climb into the winter sky. Later, after the sheep had been secured in their shelter, after he had warmed himself by the fire and eaten the first food he had consumed in nearly a day, after his body had fully registered that it was safe now, that the crisis had passed, the shepherd told his family what had happened. He described the storm, the terrible cold, the approach of death, and then the impossible warmth that had come from nowhere, that had sustained them through the night, that had saved every single animal and himself when all should have been lost. His wife listened with tears streaming down her face, understanding that she was hearing about a miracle, that her husband had been touched by something divine, that their family had been spared a tragedy through grace that could not be explained but could only be received with gratitude. The children listened with wide eyes, processing a story that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, that would become part of their family's history, that would shape their understanding of faith and protection and the possibility of miracles. In the days that followed, as the shepherd recovered fully and life returned to its normal rhythms, the story began to spread through the community. He told it to neighbors who came to see him, who had heard that he had survived the storm and wanted to know how. He told it at the village gathering place, where men met to share news and stories. He told it in the church, when the priest asked him to give testimony to God's mercy, to help strengthen the faith of others who struggled with doubt or fear. Some who heard the story believed it immediately, recognizing it as the kind of miracle that happens to those who are faithful in small things, who do their duty regardless of cost, who love the creatures in their care with a devotion that echoes divine love. Others were more skeptical, suggesting natural explanations. Perhaps the rock had retained more heat than he realized. Perhaps his body's own heat had been sufficient. Perhaps his memory of how cold it had been was distorted by fear and stress. But the shepherd knew what he had experienced. He knew the difference between natural warmth and the miracle that had saved him. He bore witness to what he had witnessed, told his truth as he understood it, and left others free to interpret it as they would. The miracle had been given to him, had saved his life and his livelihood, and whether others believed it or not could not change that fundamental reality. His flock thrived in the months that followed. The ewes bore healthy lambs that spring, more than in previous years, as if the miracle had extended into their fertility and vitality. The wool they produced was of exceptional quality, thick and strong, commanding good prices at market. The shepherd's family prospered, not becoming wealthy but achieving a security they had not known before, as if the miracle's blessing continued to operate in subtle ways, ensuring that those who had been saved would not merely survive, but would flourish. When medieval people told and retold the story of the shepherd and his frozen flock, they were not merely sharing an interesting tale or passing time with entertainment. They were teaching, preserving wisdom, maintaining hope, and affirming beliefs that were essential to their survival, both physical and spiritual. The story operated on multiple levels simultaneously, carrying meanings that accumulated and reinforced each other, creating a narrative that was far richer than its simple surface would suggest. At the most basic level, the story was about divine protection extending to the humble and the faithful. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, with shepherds occupying a low position, closer to the bottom than the top of the social order. They were not knights or nobles or wealthy merchants. They were working people who labored with their hands and their bodies, who lived simply, who had little power or influence in the larger structures of society. Yet the miracle story insisted that these humble people mattered, that their struggles were seen, that divine care extended to them as much as to any bishop or king. This was profoundly important in a time when social inequality was vast and largely unchallenged, when most people lived hard lives with little prospect of improvement. The shepherd's miracle offered reassurance that status in society did not determine status in the eyes of God, that the last would be first, that the meek would inherit the earth, that those who seemed insignificant by human standards might be precisely those whom heaven watched most carefully. The story also taught about loyalty and responsibility. The shepherd in the story could have abandoned his flock and saved himself. No one would have blamed him for making that choice. His family would have preferred having him alive without the sheep to having him dead alongside them. But he stayed because staying was what shepherds did, what his role demanded, what his relationship with the animals and his care required of him. His loyalty, even unto death, was what opened the door to the miracle. This pattern appeared throughout Christian teaching, that faithfulness in small things leads to being trusted with larger things, that doing your duty regardless of reward or recognition is what virtue looks like, that love means commitment even when commitment becomes costly. The shepherd embodied these values perfectly, and the miracle that saved him affirmed that such values were not naive or foolish, but aligned with how the universe actually operates, with divine principles that reward faithfulness, even when human logic would suggest abandonment, is the more reasonable choice. The warmth itself carried symbolic weight that medieval audiences would have recognized immediately. Warmth was life, cold was death. Warmth was God's presence, cold was God's absence. Warmth was grace, cold was judgment. The invisible, sourceless warmth that surrounded the shepherd and his flock was therefore not just a physical phenomenon, but a spiritual one, a tangible manifestation of divine favor. Grace made almost touchable, love expressed through the most basic of physical needs being met in the most miraculous of ways. The timing of the miracle, coming in the deepest part of the night, in the darkest and coldest hours, also carried meaning. This was when things were worst, when hope was most absent, when death seemed most certain. The miracle did not prevent the crisis. It did not keep the storm from happening or stop the shepherd from making the poor judgment that led to him being caught in it. It came instead at the worst possible moment, suggesting that divine intervention operates according to its own timing, that help comes not necessarily when we want it, but when we most desperately need it, at the point where human resources have failed completely and only grace can save. The sheep themselves were important to the symbolic structure of the story. In Christian theology and imagery, sheep represented believers, the faithful, those under the care of the good shepherd who was Christ himself. The earthly shepherd protecting his flock at the cost of his own life mirrored the divine shepherd who laid down his life for his sheep. The story thus operated as a kind of parable, teaching about Christ's relationship to believers through the concrete example of an actual shepherd and actual sheep. But the symbolism was not merely abstract theology. Medieval people lived closer to animals than we do, depended on them more directly, understood them more intimately. Sheep were not just symbols, but real creatures that people knew by sight and sound and smell, whose personalities they recognized, whose births and deaths they witnessed. The shepherd's love for his flock was not sentimental, but practical, born of daily care and mutual dependence. when the story said he loved them enough to die with them. This was not romantic exaggeration, but a realistic description of the bond that could develop between shepherds and their animals. The miracle's quiet nature. No angels singing, no dramatic visions, no loud voices from heaven. Also taught something important about how divine action often works. Not through spectacle or overwhelming display, but through subtle, almost unnoticeable interventions that accomplish everything necessary without disturbing the ordinary patterns of the world more than required. The warmth was extraordinary in its effect, but ordinary in its expression. Just warmth, just enough to sustain life. Nothing flashy or dramatic or designed to impress observers. This reflected a sophisticated theological understanding that miracles are not violations of natural law, but the operation of a higher law, that divine action works through nature rather than against it. That grace meets us where we are rather than demanding we come to some spectacular supernatural realm. The shepherd did not need angels or visions. He needed warmth, and warmth was provided, and that was miracle enough. The story also functioned as a community memory, a way of saying this happened to us, to people we know, in places we recognize. Whether the events occurred exactly as described or had been embellished in the telling mattered less than the story's function as a testimony, as evidence that the community had witnessed divine care, that miracles were not just ancient history from biblical times, but present reality that could touch any life at any moment. This was crucial for maintaining faith during difficult periods, for getting through winters that tested endurance, for surviving the constant hardships that characterized medieval life. If miracles could happen to a shepherd on a hillside, they could happen to anyone, anywhere. God had not stopped intervening in human affairs. Grace was still operative. Hope was still reasonable, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. The story's preservation and transmission across generations also taught something about the value of storytelling itself, about the role of narrative in maintaining culture and faith and community identity. These stories were not written down in books for most of their existence. They lived in human memory, in the voices of grandparents telling grandchildren, of priests incorporating them into sermons, of travelers sharing them at inns, of families recounting them around fires on winter nights. Each telling was slightly different, adapted to the particular audience and circumstances, but the core remained constant. The story survived because people needed it, because it carried truths that had to be remembered, because it affirmed values that had to be maintained, because it offered hope that had to be renewed with each generation. As we come to the end of this tale, as we prepare to leave that medieval hillside and return to our own time and place, it is worth reflecting on what this old story offers to us. So many centuries removed from the world that gave it birth, so different in our circumstances, yet perhaps not so different in our deepest needs. We do not face the literal life or death struggles with nature that medieval shepherds faced, most of us. Our winters, while sometimes harsh, are softened by technology and infrastructure that would have seemed miraculous to people in earlier times. We have heating that keeps our homes warm, clothing designed to protect against extreme cold, systems of rescue and support that mean being caught in a storm rarely results in death. We are, in material terms, safer and more comfortable than any shepherd in medieval Europe could have imagined. Yet we know our own forms of cold, our own winters of the spirit that test us in ways that central heating cannot address. We face situations where we feel abandoned, exposed, certain that we cannot survive what is happening to us. We experience the spiritual equivalent of that frozen hillside, times when warmth seems absent, when hope fades, when we believe we are dying in ways that matter even if our physical bodies continue functioning. The shepherd's story speaks to these experiences. It reminds us that sometimes, in the darkest hours, warmth comes from sources we cannot identify or explain. That when we have done all we can do, when we have been faithful to our responsibilities even at great cost, when we have chosen loyalty over self-preservation, we may find that we are not alone. That protection exists beyond what we can provide for ourselves. That grace operates in ways we cannot predict or control, but can recognize and receive with gratitude when it arrives. The story also teaches us about staying present through the difficult times, about not abandoning what we are responsible for even when abandonment would be easier or more comfortable. The shepherd could have left his flock and saved himself. He would have been poorer, would have faced hardship, but he would have lived. Instead, he stayed, willing to die alongside the creatures in his care, because that was what love required, what duty demanded, what his bond with them meant. We face similar choices in different contexts. We are tempted to abandon relationships when they become difficult, to walk away from responsibilities when they become costly, to prioritize our own comfort and safety over our obligations to others. The shepherd's story suggests that staying matters, that faithfulness is its own reward even before any miraculous intervention occurs, that there is dignity and meaning in not fleeing from hardship, but facing it with whatever courage and loyalty we can muster. The invisible, sourceless warmth that saved the shepherd and his flock reminds us that help can come in forms we do not expect, from directions we are not watching, through means we do not understand. We often have specific ideas about how we want to be saved, what form rescue should take, through what channels help should arrive. But grace operates according to its own logic, meets our needs in ways that may surprise us, provides what is necessary rather than what we have requested. The story invites us to remain open to this possibility, to not become so certain about what is possible or impossible that we miss the miracle when it occurs, to recognize warmth even when we cannot see its source, to accept help even when it comes in unexpected forms. It suggests that the universe is more generous, more responsive, more caring than our fears and doubts would have us believe. As the shepherd walks home through the snow with his living flock, as the morning sun climbs higher and the night of terror fades into memory, we can see in his journey a pattern that repeats across human experience. We face our nights of crisis. We endure our hours of cold and fear. We stay faithful to what matters, even when faithfulness seems futile. And sometimes, more often than we might expect if we pay attention, we discover that we have been preserved, that warmth has come from somewhere, that grace has operated in ways we could not have arranged or predicted. The sheep, moving through the snow beside their shepherd, know none of this theology or symbolism. They know only that they are alive, that they are moving, that their shepherd is with them, that they are going home. This simplicity is part of the story's power. The miracle was for them as much as for the shepherd, perhaps more, since they understood it not at all, but experienced it completely, receiving the gift of continued life without questioning its source or calculating its implications. There is something to learn from this too, from the way the sheep simply accepted the warmth and lived, from their lack of need to understand or explain before they could receive and benefit. We humans tend to complicate things, to require explanations before we can accept gifts, to analyze miracles until we have explained away their miraculous quality. Sometimes we might do better to simply stand in the warmth when it comes, to let ourselves be saved without fully understanding how, to accept grace even when we cannot trace its source or explain its mechanism. The story ends not with grand proclamations or dramatic gestures, but with simple continuation. The shepherd returns home, the sheep are cared for, life goes on. The miracle does not elevate them to some exalted state. It does not make them wealthy or famous or powerful. It simply allows them to continue being what they were, to keep living the humble life they had been living, to survive to see another spring. This too is instructive. Most of grace operates this way, not transforming our circumstances dramatically, but sustaining us through them, not lifting us out of difficulty, but providing what we need to endure it, not changing who we are fundamentally, but allowing us to keep being who we are, to continue fulfilling our responsibilities, to persist in our ordinary lives with their ordinary challenges and their extraordinary moments of connection and meaning. May this old story warm you in your own winters, whatever form they take. May it remind you that staying with what you love, even when staying becomes costly, is never wasted faithfulness. May it help you recognize warmth when it comes, even if you cannot see its source. May it encourage you to believe that you are not alone in your dark hours, that protection exists, that grace operates, that miracles still happen in quiet ways to humble people who simply need to survive one more night. The shepherd and his flock survived. They made it home. The sun rose on their continued life. And centuries later, we still tell their story, still draw hope from their experience, still find in their miracle something that speaks to our own needs for warmth and protection and the reassurance that we are seen and known and cared for even in our coldest, darkest hours. May it be so for you. May warmth surround you when cold threatens. May you survive your storms and wake to unexpected dawn. And may you walk home through the snow with gratitude in your heart and life restored, knowing that you have been held by something larger than yourself, warmed by grace you did not earn but received nonetheless. Preserved to continue your journey for reasons you may never fully understand but can accept with humble thanks.